We're in the third wave of thinking about the Reformation. I want to try a hand at what the first wave was, because you are supposedly first wavers. The first wave was that Luther and the others, he was not the only figure, some before, some after, that they were rising up against a medieval church that had become corrupt and apostate and abusive and had combined with the state and was persecuting and had forgotten the gospel and so on, and that they were trying to cleanse it, and of course they couldn't do it from within, and they were expelled, and Protestantism resulted, and we have the bipolar or multipolar religious world that we have today. That's sort of our view. Second wave, which you might know about, but you may not have heard it said as the second wave, is that the Reformation, yes, it happened, and the history books can outline it, but in reality it was the Enlightenment, or the secular development of secular learning and openness and breaking free of all constraints and the sense of the value of the individual, broken free of old political constraints and abusive church control, and so, you know, the human spirit had revealed itself, and part of the result of that was Protestantism. There's an element of truth in that, but of course the first one's what you and I think hold to, and it's very satisfactory. But what I hadn't heard till these meetings was the third wave, which is what they seem to have agreed on, that we're in the third wave of the Reformation, and the third wave is that the Protestant Reformation was in actuality the Roman Catholic Church self-correcting. You never heard that one before, did you? But that is the one now. And I've thought about this a lot, and I think that one easy way they've come at this is through Luther. Martin Luther was what he was. He was a powerful figure. He was a catalyst for change. He was the first, quote, successful reformer, because the ones before him either died in ignominy or were burned at the stake, or as one I'm going to tell you about, he was strangled and then burned, which is sort of a kindness, I guess. But, you know, they didn't really get anywhere till Luther, but Luther not only broke his area free of the Catholic Church, but he created a political division where Germany basically broke free of the Holy Roman Empire. So it was very successful on a whole bunch of fronts. But Luther, of any of the reformers by my lights, went the least distance from Roman Catholicism. Think Lutheranism, just like the Church of England, or the Episcopal Church it's been renamed here after the War of Independence. You ever wonder why it's called the Episcopal Church? After the War of Independence, it was not expedient to speak of the Church of England. That was like a foreign flag here. But both of those churches were high churches that in most ways didn't differ much from the Catholic Church. Just changing the operating authority, but having all the forms and pomp and ceremony and even some organizational structure very similar. Now, Luther's singular vision that the just shall live by faith, and that, you know, that we can have more direct access to God, or quite direct, that was a great illumination. But as I said last night, this morning, first thing this morning, it's all blurring with me. As I said first thing this morning, you go and read those 95 theses, and he does state that we live by faith. But even that statement, and every other that I can remember, they're all in the context of what right has Rome of saying contrary, or this, or forcing you to do this. He was dealing with a question of authority, which was central. And it still is. I think I gave you enough evidence already that Rome is in the process of reinstating its authority over other churches, and indeed even over secular affairs. Very important to them, because it's a hierarchical, authoritative structure. But I've come to believe that Rome has taken special ownership of Luther, and remember, on the anniversary, the Pope himself celebrated Luther's rebellion. And they talk now about the reformers. They don't say the Protestant reformers. They've somewhat taken ownership of them. And they can do it more easily with Lutheranism because about nearly 2 decades ago now, in the first of 2 landmark agreements, the main Lutheran federation sat down with the Roman Catholic Church and nutted through things, and they came to an agreement that it was sort of a misunderstanding on righteousness by faith, that now the Catholic Church see it the same way. The second agreement, that's only a year or 2 ago now, on top of the first, they said now there is no impediment to formal union. So Lutheranism may well go full cycle back. But my point is, if you're talking about the Reformation, it's a deep story. It's way more than just Luther. Now, I love Martin Luther. I love reading his stuff, and you should read it. He's not just for the academics. Martin Luther was a character of the first degree. Like I remember on one occasion he said this. I mean, it's just bizarre. He said, the angels cover their eyes because of God's glory, and he says, for the same reason I wear trousers because of the women. I mean, that's Martin Luther. I mean, he was a hearty peasant sort of a guy. Also, Martin Luther has been blamed, I think, somewhat correctly for part of the anti-Semitism of Hitler's regime. You read Luther's comments on the Jews and it will curl your hair. It's not just a passing comment. It's whole tracts and pamphlets and rants and rails. They're the devil's spawn and they need to be extirpated and their churches burned and all the rest. Horrible stuff. As Seventh-day Adventists, you would also be discouraged to read what he said about the book of Revelation. Didn't think it should be in the Bible. What was the other one? James, the Epistle of Straw. Didn't like James. Why? Because James is not so airy-fairy as some of Paul's writings, and he was laying out the requirements of following Christ, and Luther at that stage was sort of in, let's break free of the rules and go with it. And as Ellen White says correctly, Luther and the other reformers, none of them were complete. They all took things a little way, but you can't look at them as a complete picture. But I think we have been fed not so much misinformation, we've been misled by our constant focus on Luther in the sense that we aren't looking at the other reformers. It hit me fairly recently. John Bradshaw had me do one of his many programs, I think, on the Reformation. I hardly think I was even an important part of it, but he was very kind and asked me to sit down with him for one interview on the Reformation. And I can tell he had an agenda already, or a hidden script. I never saw it. And he got sort of rattled, not angry at me, but I could tell it upset his apple cart when we were talking about Luther. He wanted to steer it always to Luther. And I said to him, you must understand the American experience has very little to do with Luther and everything to do with Calvin, John Calvin. We're in the Calvinist stream, not the Lutheran stream. And if you understand that, you start to understand the real history of the United States. I'll pick it up midstream, because I might run out of time anyway, on my real preoccupation with history. I mean, I like history generally, but even before I came into this job, I was very enamored with the English Civil War. Anyone know about that Civil War? You read The Great Controversy and other Adventist early material, and you become fairly well informed about the French Revolution, which was, I'm trying to think if Ellen White explains it fully, but clearly the French Revolution had a lot to do with throwing off an oppressive Catholic power that had united with the crown, a dissipated crown in France for so long that the people just had enough of both. And so in revolting against the king, they basically threw off religion, and it took on a very strong secular context. But it's worth remembering, and I know Great Controversy doesn't get into it, that 100 years before the French Revolution, 100 years before the American Revolution, which was followed very closely by the French Revolution, England had a civil war, and it was a religious civil war. And if you know that story, it explains everything about religion coming to this country. What had happened, and I'm picking up the Reformation story way after the fact, but I'll go back. But what had happened in England at that time in the mid-1600s it was nominally Protestant, on its way to gelling as a Protestant nation. Not long in the past, not Mary Queen of Scots, but Queen Mary, the oldest daughter of Henry VIII, had come to the throne. She was a Catholic, and she persecuted the Protestants. And then Elizabeth came along and tilted it back again. But they were in a sort of a yo-yo state about whether it was going to remain Protestant. And so when Charles I of Scotland became the King of England and Scotland, they were hoping for a uniter. But like we've seen a few times in the US, people that say they're uniteds don't always turn out that way. And inadvertently, he spurred people on to a sense of rebellion, because it's a Protestant country. He's nominally head of the Church of England, Henry VIII, that established that, throwing off the Pope and his control in England. But the inconvenient fact was that the king's wife was Roman Catholic. All of her connections were in France with Catholics. And the Archbishop of Canterbury, Archbishop Laud, it's never clear what he was, but everybody suspected him of trying to bring in Catholicism to England. And when he messed with the Book of Common Prayer, which basically was like their Sabbath school pamphlet, the readings that they regularly had that were updated periodically and presented to the common people who didn't always have the Bible, but the Common Prayer would be handed out in church, and this was the readings and so on. When he messed with that, they saw intimations of re-Catholicization, to make up a word, and people started getting agitated. Meanwhile, Charles, like all the autocrats of his time, believing that God had put him there, that he had the divine right of kings and no one could question him, chose to rule by himself without Parliament. In England, from the earliest days, and the intimations of it started at Runnymede with Magna Carta back in, was it 1154 or so? No, anyhow, about the 12th century. But you know, they had Parliament by the time of the English Civil War, but the king just chose to ignore it. And then he got caught. He wanted to go to war. I think it was another one of the ones with France. Needed some money. Parliament could raise money, so he called them to order. And they were very recalcitrant to give him anything. But in the meantime, since he'd last called Parliament, they had gotten true religion. Protestantism had taken full root in England, and it had manifested itself not through the Church of England, which, like Lutheranism, was sort of high church and floating on all the privileges and forms of Catholicism, but just without the Pope. But what many of his constituents in the new Parliament were Calvinistic Puritans. People, and quite literally the name meant that they tried to live pure and circumspect lives according to the Bible. They were, well, Ellen White uses, what's the term she uses? Primitive Christianity. They were primitive Christians. And some of that translated into a pretty dour and circumspect way of requiring that you be shown and seen to be godly. But it was a wonderful time of religious activity in England. And I take other talks, and I'm just throwing this in now for what it's worth. But you need to remember that some of the iconic works of English Protestantism came from this time. John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress was written right in the middle of the Civil War. He was actually a soldier in the Civil War. John Milton, the greatest English writer after Shakespeare, wrote Paradise Lost, which, if you haven't read it, you owe it to yourself as an Adventist, because it's where Ellen White got the Great Controversy theme. In fact, it's uncannily close to a lot of it, which doesn't make it either less significant. It shows we're in the great tradition of Protestantism. So when the king called Parliament, they were fractious about giving him the money, but beyond that, they didn't accept his authority as a pseudo-Catholic ruler, and they had a religious agenda. And of course, quickly things got out of control. They started taking action against him, and he dismissed, well, he didn't dismiss them immediately, but he heard that they were ringleaders, so he comes storming in with a couple of his guards, and the guys ran out the back door. So he says, I see the birds have flown. So he was shown to be impotent. Then he dismissed Parliament, and it didn't take long before Parliament was raising an army and took to the field against the king. They had a full-blown civil war for about 3 years. Great battles, Naseby, Edgehill, and so on, where the parliamentarian army became more and more Puritan. And eventually, one of their commanders, just a country gentleman named Oliver Cromwell, emerged as the dominant military figure and political figure of the time. And he once said that he would rather have a few of his psalm-singing Puritan soldiers than 100 of these, I forget his term, but the flouncy cavalier types, and that's what they did. They went into battle singing hymns, and they were called the New Model Army, and they were unstoppable. They beat the aristocracy of England and of Germany, because the foreign fighters, like they always do, came over. Prince Rupert from Germany came over, and they were defeated time after time. And in the end, Cromwell and his Puritan army captured the king, who was caught plotting behind the scenes to bring in a Catholic army to relieve him. They caught him, put him on trial in Parliament, and remember, this is 100 years before the French Revolution, put him on trial as a traitor to England and cut his head off. I can only put it down to Catholic obstinacy on Cromwell that the story doesn't get more telling among historians and people analysing European history. This was the massive event that shook Europe. The French Revolution was an after-the-fact thing to take a king's head off. And in his defense, the king said, "You cannot touch me. I'm God's anointed." He today I can shoot someone in the street and I'm fine. That's a foolish claim. But he appealed to heaven. I can do what I want. And they said, "No, we are free men." And they appealed to the doctrine of the Reformation. "And you have betrayed our Protestant cause and our nation." And they cut his head off. And then for a short time, only about 5 years, Oliver Cromwell ruled as Lord Protector of England. They offered him the crown just as George Washington had been offered the crown, but he turned it down. And in both cases, probably both of them for very practical reasons. But Oliver Cromwell ruled unchallenged. He just died of natural causes. It scares me because he was a lot younger than me. But people died of natural causes. George Washington's only in his late 50s, wasn't he? With his death, his son carried on for a few months, but it just evaporated. But Oliver Cromwell instituted the first, after the ancient days, the Republic of Rome, it was the first republic. It was a republic of England. The people's power undergirded him. He was a dictator in the sense of an autocrat, but he allowed things that even today we wouldn't allow. For example, in his lifetime, a book was published, a how-to manual on how to kill Oliver Cromwell. You think that would be allowed today in this country? Not a chance. But Oliver Cromwell did a few things that got people angry at him, and one of them was he took his army, victorious in the Civil War, across the little water to Ireland, which was Catholic, sword, killed as many as 50,000 people, replaced the lords with Protestant English rulers and English settlers, the Orangemen. If you know anything about the agitations in Ireland to this day, the Orangemen are English Protestants planted there by Oliver Cromwell. And he was hated by the Catholics, and not a defensible act, but consistent with what was happening during the Reformation, where both sides were fighting it out for autonomy and freedom from harassment from the other side. When Oliver Cromwell died, the whole cause collapsed. But I need to explain to you who was with him. They were under an overall rubric, we talk about the Puritans, who owed their doctrinal lineage to John Calvin, not to Luther. They were, the term was the confessional aspect of the Reformation, which was more deeply spiritual and doctrinal. Even though Luther spoke about righteousness by faith, he wasn't really heavy into mysticism in the sense of rebirth and new birth and changed life and so on. Luther was still do this, do that, but you're a free person to do it rather than the Catholics telling you. But the strain that came from Switzerland was more spiritual, more doctrinal, more experiential. And the track is easy to follow as it arose in England. But it wasn't just the Puritans, which was the nominal majority group, but there were other groups that you and I need to know about. There were the Levelers, because all of them at that time believed, they'd been reading the Bible, they believed they were at the end of time, that the Lord was soon to come, so there was a great millenarian sense at that time. And the Levelers believed they were about to stand before the judgment bar of God. It was Judgment Day, but we would stand before him as equals, which is true. So since that was about to be, in advance of it, we will level society. So they were precursors, if you like, to the party in Italy called Christian Socialists. You know, it was sort of having all things in common, and we're equal because we're under Christ. But it was levelling society, which was revolutionary at that time. Even in England today, there's still the Lord's Manor high up on the hill and the houses clustered in the village where the peons would go out and work in the fields. Another group were called the Ranters. These were the guys that were studying prophecy, and they were basically the street preachers, just wild and woolly pronouncements. Another one, most significant for us, were the Fifth Monarchy men. They had been studying Daniel 2, the image of Daniel, and they believed that they were soon to experience the fifth and final kingdom, the return of Christ. So when Oliver Cromwell died, his son couldn't hold it together, and amazingly, the people had had enough of it wasn't repressive, but there were not a lot of parties and frivolity and so on, and they wanted more of the same, so they invited the king's son back. He was called the Merry Monarch. It was a time of wine, women and song in England in the Restoration. But he was actually very serious-minded because he methodically set about killing and imprisoning or imprisoning everybody that signed his father's death warrant or had anything to do with it. John Milton, the great author, barely escaped execution, but he had powerful friends. Many were killed. Oliver Cromwell himself was dug up, hung, his body was hung, and then head chopped off and hung on a post for a couple of 100 years. It hung on public display. Great vilification. But the story that I want to tell you is that is when, so this was toward the end, in the last few decades of the 1600s, that's when tens of thousands of Civil War revolutionaries, Puritans, fled to America. It wasn't when a little boatload of them came at Plymouth Rock. They were an early group that had previously left England when there was harassment of the Puritans and gone to Holland. Again, no accident, because Holland was another confessional state, very much influenced by John Calvin, and then came to northern New England. But most of the refugees came decades later, after the collapse of Oliver Cromwell's regime. They brought with them American exceptionalism, the idea that God was in the endeavor, that this was a grand effort to establish, as even one of the hymns in England today says, the kingdom of God on England's green and pleasant clime. Well, they weren't going to do it there anymore. They'd do it here. And it does lead to a certain triumphalism. But to reiterate again, the thread here is Calvin, not Luther. The other group that it's worth mentioning that ended up here in large French Huguenots. That you can find in the Great Controversy. They also were an outgrowth of Calvinism, and they became a large religious faction in Catholic France. They were endured for a while, had various edicts of toleration, but then, I should know the year offhand, but I'm bad on dates. Then thought I wrote it down. Yeah, in 1572, which predated the English Civil War, but things continued after that. In 1572, there was the St. Bartholomew Day massacre where they were killed by the thousands, and from that point on, there was just increasing persecutions, marginalization, and there were just waves of them that came across into the New World. So, and to this day, you can still track some of the area where there's this French influence. Nearly always they're Huguenots. So the French Huguenots with a Protestant sensibility informed by Calvin, and Civil War veterans, Puritans with a revolutionary fervor, swept into this area. And a lot of these Civil War veterans ended up in the South, Georgia and places like that. To me, that explains almost totally the religious flavor of the United States and even where it is today. But let me go back further and remind you of the Reformation's roots that are quite separate from Martin Luther. There was a man that was called the Morning Star of the Reformation. Anyone? John Wycliffe. And it's not just that he was the morning star. Think it through a little bit. Luther is presented as erupting full blown and then leading the Reformation. In reality, Wycliffe had much more to do, particularly in England, but in many ways in Europe, with fomenting, if you could use such a word, the Reformation than Luther did, because Wycliffe lived a longish life. He was never executed, although many intended to do that to him, but he died of relatively old age of natural causes, and admittedly after his death they dug him up, burned him, and threw his ashes in the river. It was not just hatred. You got to remember what they were doing then. A good Christian was buried on hallowed ground in the churchyard. So if you were declared an apostate, you couldn't be in hallowed ground. You had to be, like even suicide, you couldn't be buried in the churchyard. So after the fact he's declared an apostate, they had to dig him up, and then they showed their malice because they didn't want him anywhere else, burn him and just cast him to the waters. But John Wycliffe was an Oxford Don. And only a year ago I was back in Oxford, and I remember walking down the main street there. And I did know a bit of the history, but it still surprised me. I was walking with my kids across the street at one point to go to some shop from our parking spot. And here in the middle of the street, there's just a little iron railing with a bit of a concrete or a stone pedestal. And here it says, on this spot, Latimer and Ridley were burned at the stake. Well, they were quite a bit after Ridley's to Wycliffe's era. But still, Oxford and the centre of learning there was an engine generating what amounted to the English Reformation. And John Wycliffe came up with most of the major things of the Reformation. We better get the year straight again. In the late 1300s. He said that icons and images shouldn't be worshipped. He said that the Pope had no authority to set himself up as like a king over people. He questioned the doctrine of transubstantiation, which, by the way, was never formally put as church dogma until the mid-1800s. I don't know if you know that. It was held for a long time, but it was not made non-negotiable. It was only made non-negotiable relatively recent. So he questioned all of these things, and most dangerously said that the average person needed to be able to read the Bible, which really, to this day, sets the Catholics a bit on edge. And he put his mouth or his hand where his mouth was and started translating the Bible. from 1382 to 1395, he translated the Bible into common English. And you, in essence, are reading it today because his version was the version that was retranslated or massaged slightly that became the King James Version. It wasn't a radical shift from Wycliffe's translation. And then, more significant for the Reformation, he gathered a cadre of mostly young people about him called Lollards that he sent out into the countryside and to other countries in Europe, spreading his ideas. So when you put it all together, I don't see how Luther can be so clearly identified as the single figure of the Reformation when his ideas, his activities, translating and generating followers and sending them out, was so much more significant for Wycliffe. And it wasn't like he was unnoticed. They harassed him and they chased him to Europe at one point. When he died, as I say, he was desecrated, but a number of his followers were burned at the stake and martyred. So they harassed the Lollards. Then John Huss is the Seventh-day Adventist. I know I got it out of great controversy, but I remember seeing films of Jan Hus or John Huss in Bohemia. Huss himself said that his rebellion, his doctrinal initiative, came from John Wycliffe. And Huss got people's attentions internationally in some ways more than Wycliffe because Huss generated a true peasant rebellion in Bohemia, a political upheaval, which Wycliffe never did. But then in England there was William Tyndale. He again worked on the Bible, worked on Wycliffe's, and it was a version that ended up in the King James. And Tyndale and others came up at the time of Queen Mary. And I'll go back again and tell you what happened in the English Reformation. And you need to know it. I'm just flitting over it. But rehearse it to yourself, because apart from these three waves, which does away with the whole concept of the Reformation, for years now the Catholic Church have been maligning Henry VIII as just a serial bigamist. I guess all bigamists are serial, but an immoral type that out of convenience just cut himself free from Rome. It's a misapprehension, because the Reformation in England was already underway, as well as the fact that Henry VIII wasn't as stupid and as self-centered as people imagine. He, in fact, even wrote a very learned and long treatise against Martin Luther. England was not overly sympathetic to Martin Luther. But then, as Tyndale and others, there was a whole coterie of them, started to talk to the king, they got him sympathetic to Calvinism. And Henry VIII, like the ways of kings, he decided the answer to a repressive Rome is he would become an oppressive head of the Church of England. And it was interesting in our questions about state aid and so on. The first thing they did in England in the Reformation was took over all the church property, because it was an offence to the average Englishman that the church owned so much. Even today, the Catholic Church takes offerings and that, never gives it back. It just builds its edifices. And, the Catholic Church does a lot in this country, Catholic Charities and all the rest. I'm telling you, they take a lot. I was and I'm diverting, but you need to know this. I was at a meeting once on state aid, and the Catholic Charities person even admitted that at that time the Catholic Charities got something like about 80-90% of all the state monies given to church operations. Massive. And it offended the Englishmen here. The church was piling up, I think it's a term from Illinois, piling up to herself all these monies and fortunes, and they took it. The other thing that was a problem in England, and Henry ended it, is that there were civil courts and ecclesiastical courts. And the church, of course, very conveniently, even if a priest killed someone in cold blood and in plain sight, they wouldn't come before a civil court. The church would try them. So Henry did away with the church courts. Civil courts had to apply to everybody. So there were some real justice issues that took place in the Reformation in England. But Henry tried a number of times to have children. And I'm sure there's one thing you don't know. He did have a son. And his son did rule after him. His son, I keep thinking Henry, but what was his name? It's the Queen's youngest son's name. Edward. There you go. Edward. It's his youngest son, right? Edward was 9, I think it was, when he took over, and he died before he was 20. And he really didn't rule in his own right. He had a council of regents. But those regents, most of them, there was a council, I think there were about a dozen. Most of them, again, were Calvinist-influenced Protestants. And they progressively brought in what we know as English Protestantism. And Edward went along with it, unfortunately died. When he died, he had an older sister. The daughter, her name was Mary, the daughter of Catherine, the Spanish first wife. And she was Catholic. She also had a beef against her father for rejecting her mother, beef against Protestantism for not being sympathetic to her mother's plight. So she became a persecutor. And when I grew up in Australia, I remember reading over and over again about Bloody Mary. Bloody Mary, Queen Mary, persecuted Protestantism, tried to drive it back into the Dark Ages. And that's when Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, who had been talking to Henry VIII and to Edward and moving the country toward Protestantism, when Mary came along, she got his number, made him in public recant for his Protestantism, put him in prison, and then at the last minute, as so often happened, he decided to change his mind and said, "No, I recant my recanting," and he was strangled and burned at the stake. Incredible. And then Hugh Latimer was the confessor to Edward, and again he was sent to the stake at that little spot I saw in Oxford, which you can still see it today. It's amazing, but traffic rumbles by all around it. Hardly anyone seems to notice. And Ridley, another theologian, and they were supposed to have said, or Latimer was said to Ridley, "Today we will start a fire that will never be put out in England." And I think they were right. It was unstoppable by that point, even though Mary and the International Catholic coalitions tried to stop it. Another thing that's worth remembering is that Protestantism didn't arrive, even though these were the Civil War in England and upheavals in one country or another, it didn't just sort of happen. There was a massive upheaval in Europe that birthed Protestantism. It was called the 30-Year War. 8 million people died in the 30-Year War. Even 8 million to die today in Europe would be massive, not as much as World War II. But nobody, I've looked up over and over again, nobody really knows how many people were in Europe at that time, but it clearly couldn't have been too many tens of millions. Because, like, how many million people were in America when it gained independence? As I remember, it was like 3 million or something, not many. So, and London was just a few 100,000 people. So for 8 million people to die was massive. In Germany, I read the other day that something like 70 to 80% of all the men died in the 30 Years' War. It got so bad that whole countries went into starvation because there was no one to till the fields. Civilization just went backwards. And at the end of the 30 Years' War, the whole, which was between Catholic and Protestant factions, the whole system was so defunct that about 160 people groups got together and they made a grand bargain called the Treaty of Westphalia. And I'm telling you this for a reason, because it's current news. Henry Kissinger, who's still alive, although he's gutturally mumbling in the back chambers as an advisor to people now. You know, he's hired by a lot of governments, and I know he advises this group now. But Henry Kissinger got his doctorate in a study of the Treaty of Westphalia, and I've heard him say a number of times, and I know he's right, that the Treaty of Westphalia made the modern world. Remember, there was the Roman Empire for hundreds of years, and it went into a slow and desperate decline, where the Bishop of Rome rose up, and little fiefdoms and warlords broke out. But what replaced Rome was really an attempt at an empire, the Holy Roman Empire, which was a sort of a Germanic a coalition, was the best you could make in Europe. And then there was Charlemagne before that. But these were attempts to recreate the Roman Empire, but not good, but under the auspices of the Pope. That was the best they could come up with. There was no real idea of autonomous countries. But after the Treaty of Westphalia, most of the modern countries of Europe were established as autonomous, sovereign countries with borders that were recognized, that could be defended, with an identity. Sadly, most times it was a combination of ethnic and religious. On a few occasions it crossed the line, but usually it was an ethnic group that had either a Protestant or a Catholic identity. And rules were set up for the interchange between those countries. And why that's significant, and I've heard Kissinger say it for many years now, and I believe it's true, we're living in the period of the unraveling of the Treaty of Westphalia. Preemptive wars where you just go in and overthrow the leader. Military adventures where you don't declare war, or just at night you send in a couple of hundred guys and execute someone. All of these break down the arrangement that's governed the world for hundreds of years since the Treaty of Westphalia. And of course, with the outbreak, a renewed outbreak of religious wars, either military or cultural, all bets are off. All bets are off. But it's worth remembering how the Reformation shaped the modern world, politically and, of course, religiously and philosophically. I've got an article, well, I shouldn't say I don't even like people to take too much credit, but I'm the editor. But I have placed in Liberty an article that a fellow named Elijah Muvandura, a fellow I discovered in Canada, he's from Kenya, I think, originally, wrote an article about the philosophical basis of the European and the English Enlightenment, and how that relates to what we have in the United States. And it's worth remembering that in that age of revolution, the formation of the modern states, many countries eventually came to trumpet the idea of individual self-fulfillment and of the natural rights of man. But there's a good argument to be made that it went a bit wrong in France and in parts of Europe, because it was cut loose from its Protestant Christian underpinnings. The philosophical father of Protestant or of democracy in the United States is clearly John Locke, an English philosopher who outlined these natural rights. But Locke was a Christian. His whole worldview was trying to put into a political, aspirational, human context the principles of divine law. Whereas in France, the philosophes and others like Voltaire and so on that carried that same idea, they hated religion. And so they tried to cut it loose from religion. And the article points out, and I think he's correct, that without religion, the self-determination that caused the Reformation, caused or led to the Reformation and caused the warfares in Europe, it goes nowhere. It's stillborn. It's sterile at the end. And in the article, he quotes Alexis de Tocqueville, a commentator of American ways and principles. And de Tocqueville saw it directly, that it was this Christian element combined with this freedom of the soul and this revolutionary fervor in the United States that made it efficacious and was its protective element. Now again, let's relate it to today. We say that the US is the home of the free and the land of the brave, and it's the last great hope for mankind, and all. Maybe they're true. But do you think there's a clear understanding today that the basis, the philosophical basis for our freedom and the very structure of our society, not our government, derives from a Christian, but even more than that, Protestant base? I don't think so. I think it's drifting away. And I believe, and the author's trying to make a case in Liberty, that if we let that drift away, we will drift toward what Europe saw. We will hasten the demise of the Treaty of Westphalia. And of course, as Ellen White says, we will go back to the models of the old world. We'll be exposed again to despotism. We'll be exposed again to autocratic religious rule and a very illiberal. It's unfortunate. Words have taken on a different meaning. Gay never used to mean what it means now, and liberal never used to mean sort of a partisan political agenda. But in the best sense, liberal was a freedom-loving openness that cut loose from bad restraints, oppression, despotism, religious control, and so on. So the question at the end of the day, I'll repeat it again just for emphasis. When we talk about the Reformation, what do we understand as Americans? And we've got many cultural connections, but this country has a pretty bright line back to English history. Do we recognize that we're in a progression, political and religious progression from the Reformation, that has a little bit to do with Luther, but a lot more to do with another branch of Protestantism? Now, where I live in Hagerstown, Maryland, not too far, well, it's right on the edge of Pennsylvania, and not too far from us. I go to a grocery store not long across the border, and you see guys in horses and buggies. They're the Anabaptists. I just the other day, I'm learning all the time, I read a lot of history. I'd heard about the Münster Rebellion in Germany, but you should read it. Your kids are reading the Hunger Games and books like that will turn your hair, but tell them about the Münster Rebellion. It's just as amazing. There was an Anabaptist group that took over the city of Münster, Germany. They were radical Protestants. Of course, they believed in baptism, but they had some radical social ideas as well. So they took it over, and their leader, whose name escapes me, eventually proclaimed himself a prophet, then a king. He took dozens of the women to be his wives and started executing people right and center, and it just spun so far out of control, the central government came in and put it down with great force and killed him, well, actually tortured and then killed the ruler and a bunch of his confederates, and hung them in cages over the city gates, where they hung for about 100 years as an object lesson to anyone that would try something so bizarre. That's the background that you might not know, part of the background to the very peaceful, nice Amish and Mennonites and all the rest that ended up sheltering here. They were a radical sect, and their end result, and they rethought their experiments, their end result was, we don't want to know anything about the rest of you. We're going to do our own thing. But Baptists, as we understand them today, are not closely connected with the Anabaptists. Baptists, really, again, are another outgrowth of Calvinism. The Baptists are closely connected to the Puritans, and in this country, the Baptist fervor is definitely a continuation of the Reformation cleansing and political energy that was generated. We're in that progression, not Lutheran, right? Now, when you talk about the ecumenical movement, unfortunately, it's It's taken casualties everywhere, and the Protestant world, as Ellen White predicted, and you don't have to be a prophet to know that it would happen. Time erodes all revolutionary parties and revolutionary ideas. Time dissipates all sorts of knowledge. You think you know about Abraham Lincoln, you think you know about George Washington. We have a caricature of them there. So things dissipate. It's very hard to keep the reality of something. And there's no question that Protestantism has forgotten its moorings. But it is, and we could have predicted that. But it is disheartening, I think, to see in this country that had such a strong Protestant identity, remember at the same time, not always good. There was talk of Charlottesville and that horrible... The experience was bad, but the US has had plenty of right-wing skinhead riots and all the rest, and you can go and see pictures of Nazi rallies right before World War II in the US. There's a lot of wonderful and dangerous groups in this country. What was bad about Charlottesville was the reaction, how it played out. I think that was very dangerous. But there's no question that at this late point, Protestantism, which in the past has embraced things like Ku Klux Klan, you don't want to know it, but the Ku Klux Klan was dedicated to a white Protestant America. And much of its violence was directed against Jews and Catholics. The persecution of Catholics at times was severe in the US. I should get more of the facts on it, but I'm constantly repeating a story that I remember reading years ago about a weekend-long riot in New York City where a crowd of tens of thousands rampaged through New York City, killing any Catholic they could lay their hands on. That's our history. And Protestantism in its twisted form was implicated. But that said, the doctrinal impetus that came out of the Reformation through Protestantism has been alive and well in the US and salting this culture for a long time. And now that the Pope of Rome appears as an angel of light, now that Protestants generally, I think, like many Adventists, hardly could tell you what they believe, hardly could tell you their history. They're sitting ducks for reaping into a sort of a globalist religious view, and most ominously, the philosophical foundation for this liberal representative republic. Read the Liberty article, which arguably is as it is and as strong as it is because of its strong Protestant Christian thread. That's being removed. So what is likely to happen next? People say that history repeats itself. It doesn't really, but human nature is a constant. But what I think we're in a part of now is the devolution of history. It's unraveling and going back to its origins. And you and I can't necessarily stop it, but as Ellen White said, and maybe this is time, we're about to finish time. I had a quote that if I can't find it, I'll do it by memory, but we read it all the time. Well, maybe I didn't bring it, but she says that, she says something to the effect that many people say that these things are going to happen. Sunday law will happen eventually, so they fold their hands, sit back in calm expectation. She says we should do all that we can to speak out and to hold back these times, because she says Satan is setting things so that you have neither justice nor mercy, and we should do anything we can to inhibit restrictions on liberty of conscience. And I think a big part of what we can do is to be self-aware of the dynamic we're part of. I'm afraid in America today, religious or otherwise, people are oblivious to their freedoms just drifting away. So we need to be self-aware, and then through many mechanisms, obviously Liberty Magazine is one vicarious way your church is doing it, but you can be conversant in the basis of your freedoms, and that's why I reacted so it bothered the others. Don't rely on your church issuing some edict. They may be right or wrong. You should know what your church thinks, and be able to apply that yourself in any situation consistent with your set of beliefs as an Adventist, as a Christian, as a Protestant. Adventism was always at great lengths in its early days to establish its Protestant bona fides. And I'll finish with this comment. I enjoy doing the television program on 3ABN, and I've had some interesting guests over the years. And one of my guests was Ambassador Seipel. He was the first U.S. ambassador for religious freedom. He's retired not too far from here, actually. I forget the town, but it's along this corridor. And he'd been in charge of World Vision at one point. He was head of a Baptist college, and then U.S. ambassador for religious freedom under Clinton. And for years, he's worked with our church. They even appointed him head of the IRLA, the International Religious Liberty Association. And I thought he knew about Adventists. And he asked me two leading questions on the trip when I drove him from St. Louis to the studio. First one, he said, what do Adventists believe? And I said, no one's ever told you? No. So I had to explain. And on the way back, he said, are Seventh-day Adventists Protestants? Couldn't believe it. And so I said, as part of the answer, I explained how we were. And I said, I thought you were a Baptist. Oh, I say I'm a Baptist. He says, I don't really, go to the church or whatever. And so I said, well, why don't you join with us? And he said, well, I might. And I'm not under any illusions. He hasn't yet. But there's people out there, more than you might realize, even in major positions. Here's a guy that was heading a Baptist college, a top religious figure for the country, doesn't know what we believe, even though he's been close to us, and is open enough if it's explained to him. You have a great opportunity to define yourself and your church and to reach out and make a difference in other people's lives. We have to do that. We're in the building I'm in at the moment, they're in love with Twitter and websites and all the rest, and you have to use all these mechanisms. But just think of one reality. The gospel went to the known world in one lifetime by word of mouth. And you can easily do the maths in our age. If Adventists were alive and talking to the neighbors and so on, it wouldn't be but a few weeks. Everyone would know who we are. Doesn't depend on electronic media. And I'll put it another way around. If you tell the world on every Facebook page that's going about this mythical Adventist group and you're not like it, it won't help anything much. It's time for us to stand up and speak out and to be something. And we can start with our prophetic understanding. We can start with our Protestant heritage and take it from there, I think. Thanks very much. God bless you.